Jake Morrison stood outside the Henderson Aerospace facility and watched his future walk away in the form of a sleek black company car, carrying someone else to his dream position as junior engineer. He had spent 3 years studying spacecraft, repair and maintenance at the technical college, and graduated top of his class, but the job went to someone with more experience and better connections. His phone buzzed with a text from his roommate asking if he got the position, and Jake shoved the device back in his pocket without responding, because he could not face explaining another failure. The parking lot was nearly empty now, as the afternoon sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, and Jake walked slowly toward the bus stop at the edge of the property. That was when he noticed the ship. It sat in the far corner of the lot behind a chain-link fence and looked nothing like the human vessels Jake had trained on during his studies. The hull was a strange purple metal that seemed to shift colors in the sunlight, and the design was all wrong, with curves where human ships had angles, and what looked like organic patterns etched into the surface. Jake stopped walking and stared, because even from a distance he could see that something was damaged on the underside of the craft. A panel hung loose and sparks occasionally flickered from the exposed interior. He looked around but saw no one nearby, and the main building was far enough away that nobody would notice if he took a closer look. The fence had a gap near the corner where the posts had shifted, and Jake squeezed through without much difficulty. Up close, the ship was even stranger than he expected, and the purple metal felt warm under his fingers when he touched. The damaged panel had writing on it in symbols Jake did not recognize, but the internal systems looked somewhat similar to human technology, though far more advanced. Jake set his backpack down and pulled out the basic toolkit he always carried, because even without a job, he could not break the habit of being prepared. The problem was obvious once he got the panel fully open, because 3 connectors had come loose from their ports and the power flow was disrupted. It took him 20 minutes to carefully reattach each connector and make sure the power distribution returned to normal levels. He was tightening the last screw on the panel when a voice behind him said something in a language he did not understand. Jake spun around and found himself face to face with a woman who was definitely not human. She stood about 6 feet tall, with pale blue skin and silver hair that floated around her head as if gravity did not quite apply to it. Her eyes were large and golden, and she wore a fitted suit made of the same color-shifting material as the ship. Jake opened his mouth to apologize or explain, but no words came out because his brain was still processing the fact that he was looking at an actual alien. The woman tilted her head and studied him for a moment before switching to English with only a slight accent that Jake could not place. She asked what he was doing to her ship, and her tone suggested she was more curious than angry. Jake finally found his voice and explained that he saw the damage and could not help himself because he was trained in spacecraft repair. The woman walked past him and examined the panel Jake had just secured, and after a moment she touched something on her wrist device, and the ship hummed to life with all systems showing green on the external display. She turned back to Jake with an expression he could not quite read and asked where he learned to work on Zentari vessels. Jake admitted he had never seen a Zentari vessel before today, but the basic principles of power distribution were similar enough to human systems that he figured out what needed to be done. The woman, whose name was Lyra, introduced herself as the captain of the ship and explained she had been stuck in this lot for 2 days trying to find someone who could make the repairs. She had gone to Henderson Aerospace that morning to see if they could help, but they said their engineers were too busy with human contracts to work on alien technology. Jake felt a strange twist in his stomach when he realized Lyra must have been in the building at the same time he was interviewing for the job he did not get. Lyra asked if Jake worked for Henderson, and he laughed bitterly before explaining that he had just been rejected for a position there despite his qualifications. She nodded slowly and seemed to be thinking about something before she asked if Jake would be interested in a different kind of job. Jake was not sure what she meant, but nodded anyway, because he had nothing to lose at this point. Lyra explained that she was the chief of operations for the Zentari Mining Corporation, which had recently established trade agreements with Earth. They were looking to hire human engineers who could work on both human and alien technology to help maintain their growing fleet of ships that operated in human space. The position would require Jake to relocate to their main hub station in orbit around Mars, and the pay was triple what Henderson had been offering. Jake stared at her because this had to be some kind of joke or mistake. Lyra smiled for the first time and assured him she was completely serious because anyone who could repair a Zentari ship without training or instructions was exactly the kind of creative problem solver her company needed. She pulled a small device from her pocket and handed it to Jake, explaining it was a communication unit, and she would send him the official job offer and contract details within the next hour. Jake took the device with shaking hands and asked why she would offer him such an important position, based on one simple repair. Lyra looked back at her ship and said, the repair was not simple, because most trained engineers would not have recognized the problem, let alone fixed it without asking for help or instructions. She also admitted that she had been watching him through the ship sensors from the moment he squeezed through the fence, and she was impressed by his careful, methodical approach to the problem. Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment but also pride because someone finally recognized his skills. Lyra asked if he needed time to think about the offer, and Jake almost laughed because there was nothing to think about. He accepted, on the spot, and Lyra nodded approvingly before climbing into her ship. She paused at the entrance and told Jake to be ready to leave Earth in 3 days, because that was when the next transport to Mars departed. The ship lifted off silently and disappeared into the afternoon sky, leaving Jake standing alone in the parking lot with a communication device in his hand and a completely different future ahead of him. He pulled out his phone and finally responded to his roommate text. But instead of explaining, a failure, he got to share the most incredible opportunity of his life. As Jake walked back to the bus stop, he glanced one more time at the Henderson Aerospace building and felt grateful that they had rejected him, because if they had offered him that junior engineer position, he would never have been in the parking lot at the exact right moment to meet Lyra. 3 days later, Jake stood on the launch platform with a single suitcase containing everything he owned and watched Earth shrink below him as the transport carried him toward Mars. Lyra met him at the hub station and gave him a tour of the facility, which was larger and more advanced than anything Jake had seen in photographs or videos. She introduced him to the engineering team, which included humans and several different alien species all working together on various projects. Jake spent his first week learning about Zentari technology and discovering that his instincts about power distribution had been correct because the principles were universal, even if the applications varied. By the end of his second week, Jake was leading a small team to retrofit a mining vessel with hybrid human-Zentari systems. Lyra stopped by occasionally to check on his progress, and Jake noticed she seemed pleased with how quickly he adapted to the new environment. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Lyra invited Jake to join her for a meal in the station observation deck. They sat near the large windows overlooking Mars, and Lyra asked how Jake was adjusting to his new life. Jake admitted it was overwhelming sometimes, but he had never been happier because he was finally doing the work he loved with people who valued his contributions. Lyra smiled and confessed that offering Jake the job had been one of her better impulses because he brought a fresh perspective that her team had been missing. Jake asked what she meant, and Lyra explained that most of her engineers had decades of experience, but sometimes experience made people rigid in their thinking. Jake approached problems with curiosity rather than assumptions, and that made him valuable in ways that went beyond technical skills. He felt his face heat up again but managed to thank her for taking a chance on him. Lyra raised her glass in a toast and said she had not taken a chance because she knew exactly what she was doing when she hired him. As they sat together watching the red planet slowly rotate below them, Jake realized that losing the Henderson job had not been a failure at all. It had been the universe pushing him towards something far better than he could have imagined, and it had all started because he could not walk past a broken ship without trying to fix it.